After failing twice to win support for her plan in votes in the House of Commons, May, in a closed-door meeting with rank-and-file members of the Conservative Party on March 27, 2019, pledged to step down as Prime Minister if Parliament approved her plan. This time around, the promise of May's imminent departure won Johnson's support for her plan. However, once again it went down to defeat. Having failed to win sufficient support for her plan from Conservatives, unable to negotiate a compromise with the opposition, and assailed by ever more members of her own party, May announced that she would resign as party leader on June 7 but remain as caretaker Prime Minister until her party had chosen her successor. This opened up a campaign to replace her that found Johnson among 10 candidates who were put to the parliamentary party in a series of aye votes that eventually winnowed the field to 4 contenders: Boris Johnson, Jeremy Hunt, Michael Gove, and Sajid Javid, the Home Secretary. After Gove and Javid fell by the wayside in subsequent votes, Johnson and Hunt stood as the final candidates in an election in which all of the party's nearly 160,000 members were eligible to vote. Some 87% of those eligible voters participated and elevated Johnson to the leadership when the results were announced on July 23. In winning 92,153 votes, Johnson captured some 66% of the vote, compared with about 34% for Hunt, who garnered 46,656 votes. On July 24, 2019, the day following Johnson's election as Conservative Party leader, Queen Elizabeth II accepted Theresa May's resignation and appointed Johnson as Prime Minister. This made Johnson the first Prime Minister to be born outside British territories. Johnson appointed Dominic Cummings as his senior advisor. In his first speech as PM, Johnson said that the United Kingdom would leave the European Union on October 31, 2019 with or without a deal, and promised to remove the Irish backstop from the withdrawal agreement. Johnson declared his intention to reopen negotiations, but talks did not immediately resume as the EU refused to accept Johnson's condition that the backstop be removed. On August 28, 2019, UK and EU negotiators agreed to resume regular meetings. Also on August 28, 2019, Johnson declared he had asked the Queen to prorogue Parliament from September 10, reducing the time in which Parliament could block a no-deal Brexit and causing a political controversy. The Queen at Privy Council approved prorogation later the same day, and it began on September 10, scheduled to last until October 14. Some suggested that this prorogation amounted to a self-coup, and on August 31, 2019, protests occurred throughout the United Kingdom. As of September 2, 2019, 3 separate court cases challenging Johnson's action were in progress or scheduled to take place, and on September 11, 3 Scottish judges ruled the prorogation of the UK Parliament to be unlawful. On September 12, Johnson denied lying to the Queen over suspension of the Parliament, while a Belfast court rejected claims that his Brexit plans will have a negative impact on Northern Ireland's peace policy. On September 24, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that Johnson's advice to prorogue Parliament was unlawful, and therefore the prorogation was rendered null. When Parliament resumed on September 3, 2019, Johnson indicated he would call a general election under the Fixed-Term Parliaments Act after opposition and rebel Conservative MPs successfully voted against the government to take control of the order of business to prevent a no-deal exit. Despite government opposition, the BEN Act, a bill to block a no-deal exit, passed the Commons on September 4, 2019, causing Johnson to propose a general election on October 15. His motion was unsuccessful as it failed to command the support of 2/3 of the House. In October 2019, following bilateral talks between Johnson and Dowsiak Leo Varadkar, the UK and EU agreed to a revised deal, which replaced the backstop with a new Northern Ireland Protocol. Johnson appointed his cabinet on July 24, 2019, dismissing 11 senior ministers and accepting the resignation of 6 others. The mass dismissal was the most extensive post-war cabinet reorganization without a change in the ruling party. Among other appointments, Johnson made Dominic Raab the first Secretary of State and Foreign Secretary and appointed Sajid Javid and Priti Patel as the Chancellor of the Exchequer and Home Secretary, respectively. On September 3, 2019, Philip Lee crossed the floor to the Liberal Democrats following a disagreement with Johnson's Brexit policy. This left the government without a working majority in the House of Commons. Later that day, 21 Conservative MPs had the party whip withdrawn for defying party orders and supporting an opposition motion. The whip was restored to 10 former Conservative ministers on 29 October. On September 5, 2019, Johnson's brother Joe Johnson resigned from the government and announced that he would step down as MP, describing his position as torn between family and national interest. 2 days later, Amber Rudd resigned as Secretary of State for Work and Pensions and from the Conservative Party, describing the withdrawal of the party whip as an assault on decency and democracy. In October 2019, Parliament was dissolved, and an election called for December 12. The election resulted in the Conservative Party winning 43.6% of the vote and a parliamentary landslide majority of 80 seats. A key slogan used in the Conservative campaign was "Get Brexit Done." Johnson reshuffled his cabinet in February 2020. 5 cabinet ministers were sacked, including the Northern Ireland Secretary Julian Smith, a decision that was criticised by several politicians and commentators following his success in restoring the Northern Ireland executive devolved government. Chancellor of the Exchequer Sajid Javid resigned from the cabinet and was replaced by Rishi Sunak. Javid later returned to Johnson's cabinet as Secretary of State for Health and Social Care in June 2021 following the resignation of Matt Hancock. Johnson reshuffled his cabinet again in September 2021. Changes included the dismissal of Education Secretary Gavin Williamson, who had received significant criticism for his handling of disruption to education during the COVID-19 pandemic. Dominic Raab was moved from Foreign Secretary to Deputy Prime Minister and Justice Secretary. Raab was replaced as Foreign Secretary by Liz Truss. The COVID-19 pandemic emerged as a serious crisis within the first few months of Johnson's second term. Johnson's non-attendance of 5 COBR briefings during the early months and the failure of the UK government to prepare for and control the outbreak has been criticised. The UK was among the last major European states to close schools, ban public events and order a lockdown. This response is thought by some scientists to have contributed to the UK's high death toll from COVID-19, which as of January 2021 was among the highest in the world. Reuters reported that scientists were critical of Johnson both for acting too slowly to stop the spread of COVID-19 and for mishandling the government's response. Politico quoted Chief Medical Officer Chris Whitty as saying that an earlier initial lockdown would have significantly lowered the death toll. The BMJ published several editorials critical of the policies adopted during the country's public health response. Johnson's public communication over the virus and the UK's test and trace system were also criticised. On March 3, 2020, Johnson claimed to have shaken hands with COVID-19 patients in hospital on the same day that SAGE had advised the government to warn the public not to shake hands and minimize physical contact, though it was unclear whether the hospital he visited actually contained any coronavirus patients. He continued to shake hands publicly in the following days. On March 23, a COVID-19 lockdown was imposed throughout the UK, except for a few limited purposes, backed up by new legal powers. On March 27, it was announced that Johnson had tested positive for COVID-19. On April 5, he was admitted to a hospital. The next day, he was moved to the hospital's intensive care unit. Johnson left intensive care on April 9, and left hospital 3 days later to recuperate at Chequers. After a fortnight at Chequers, he returned to Downing Street on April 26. Johnson later said that he had been given emergency oxygen while in intensive care, and that doctors had made preparations in case he died. A scandal in May 2020 involved Johnson's chief political advisor Dominic Cummings, who made a trip with his family to Durham during the March 2020 lockdown while experiencing COVID-19 symptoms. Both Cummings and Johnson rejected widespread calls that Cummings resign. Johnson's defense of Cummings and his refusal to sack him caused a widespread backlash. This resulted in a loss of confidence in the government and specifically its response to the pandemic, referred to as the Cummings effect in the Lancet. Concerns were raised in the study that this could affect the public's compliance with pandemic restrictions. The Johnson ministry was accused of cronyism in their assignment of contracts related to the pandemic response. Procurement of government contracts for key COVID-19 supplies became less transparent as a result of emergency measures bypassing the usual competitive tendering process. In October 2020, Johnson conceded that the UK's test and trace system and its specially developed contact tracing app, which had been criticised for their cost and operational issues, had caused frustrations. Johnson reportedly resisted calls from SAGE and within the government to enact a second lockdown throughout September as COVID-19 infections rose. In April 2021, Johnson denied allegations he had said he would rather let the bodies pile high in their thousands. On October 30, 2020. The government enacted a second national lockdown on October 31. Throughout December 2020, COVID-19 cases across the UK rose significantly, straining emergency services and hospitals. In response, the government enacted further restrictions to large parts of southern and eastern England and on December 21 shortened a planned household mixing period over Christmas. Britain began its COVID-19 vaccination program in December 2020. Half of UK adults had received at least their first vaccine dose by March 20, 2021. A third lockdown for the whole of England was introduced on January 6, 2021. Record numbers of infections and daily deaths were recorded in the UK throughout January, and the government began exploring quarantine procedures on arrival. Johnson said he was deeply sorry and takes full responsibility as the UK passed 100,000 deaths from COVID-19, the first European country to do so, on January 26. In July 2021, Johnson announced that most generalist public health restrictions in England would be lifted and replaced by recommendations. This took place despite an increase in cases driven by the Delta variant. In September 2021, Johnson was pictured in a cabinet meeting, with at least 30 people crammed shoulder to shoulder, without anyone wearing masks and with all windows apparently closed, contradicting government advice. Johnson was also photographed without a face mask during a visit to a hospital in November. In December 2021, more stringent Plan B restrictions for England were put forward, a partial renewal of previous measures due to the increased incidence of the SARS-CoV-2 Omicron variant. These proposals included face coverings to be required in more public settings, guidance to work from home wherever possible, and requirements of COVID-19 passports to enter certain venues. The government experienced the largest rebellion of Conservative MPs during Johnson's premiership, in opposition to these measures. In 2019, Johnson promised to reduce net migration to the United Kingdom, the number of people immigrating minus the number emigrating, below 250,000 per year by the next election. In 2021, net migration to the UK was 488,000, up from 184,000 in 2019 before the COVID-19 pandemic. Most of the migrants came from non-EU countries. As a result of Brexit, more EU nationals left the UK than arrived. In 2021, Johnson's government launched a scheme for Hong Kongers following the Hong Kong National Security Law, with more than 200,000 Hong Kong residents immigrating to the UK. Long-term net migration to the UK reached a record high of 764,000 in 2022, with immigration at 1.26 million and emigration at 493,000. At the state opening of Parliament on May 11, 2021, a range of proposed laws were announced, including the Dissolution and Calling of Parliament Bill, which would restore the royal prerogative to dissolve Parliament, a higher education, freedom of speech, bill to combat deplatforming at universities, an online safety bill that would impose a statutory duty of care on online companies and empower Ofcom to block particular websites, and an animal welfare, sentience, bill that would legally Recognize animal sentience. Further laws would introduce mandatory voter identification at general elections, reform the national immigration system, and implement a leveling up policy to reduce imbalances between areas. In April 2021, Cummings alleged that Johnson had arranged for donors to secretly pay for renovations on the private residence at 11 Downing Street. On April 27, Johnson asked the Cabinet Secretary, Simon Case, to hold a review about the refurbishment. On April 28, the Electoral Commission announced it had opened a formal investigation. On the same day, Johnson said that he had not broken any laws over the refurbishment and had met the requirements he was obliged to meet. During Prime Minister's questions, the leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer, asked, who initially paid for the redecoration of his Downing Street flat. Johnson responded, I paid for Downing Street's refurbishment personally. On May 28, Lord Giad published a report on the allegations which concluded that Johnson did not breach the ministerial code and that no conflict, or reasonably perceived conflict, of interest arose. However, Lord Giad expressed that it was unwise for Johnson to have proceeded without more rigorous regard for how this would be funded. The Electoral Commission reported on December 9 that it found that the Conservative Party had failed to follow the law in not accurately reporting donations to the party from Lord Brownlow and imposed a £17,800 fine on the party. The Herald said the Commission's report outlined how, in March, all the money paid by Brownlow and his company had been reimbursed, as had the payments made by the Conservative Party and Cabinet Office. Downing Street had said at the time that the full cost of the works had been met personally by the Prime Minister. In November 2021, Johnson backed a motion to block the suspension of Owen Paterson, a Conservative MP found to have abused his position by the Independent Standards Commissioner after undertaking paid lobbying. The motion called for the creation of a new Conservative majority committee to examine reforms of the standards investigation process. Many Conservative MPs refused to support the motion, and 13 defied a three-line whip to vote against it. Following the announcement by opposition parties that they would boycott the new committee, and faced with a backlash in the media and from MPs of all parties, the government announced that a new vote would take place on whether Paterson should be suspended. Paterson announced his resignation as an MP the same day. A by-election in Paterson's former constituency of North Shropshire saw the Liberal Democrat candidate, Helen Morgan, overturn a Conservative majority of nearly 23,000, the seventh largest swing in United Kingdom by-election history. In December 2021, reports emerged that social gatherings of government and Conservative Party staff in Downing Street had taken place ahead of Christmas 2020 against COVID-19 regulations. Johnson denied these allegations. Following a leaked video showing Downing Street staff joking about a fictional party, at a press conference rehearsal recorded days after one alleged party took place, Johnson apologized for the contents of the video and suggested he had been misled but had now ordered an inquiry. On January 10, 2022, ITV News reported that a planned party had taken place on May 20, 2020, during the first lockdown. ITV had obtained an email sent by Principal Private Secretary Martin Reynolds to staff inviting them to socially distanced drinks in the garden of Number 10. At the time, people outdoors were not allowed to meet more than one person from outside their household. Two eyewitnesses later alleged that Johnson and Simons attended, contradicting Johnson's insistence in December 2021 that there were no parties. On January 12, 2022, Johnson apologized to MPs in the Commons for attending an event in the Downing Street garden during the first lockdown, stating he believed it was a work event. He said that MPs should await the outcome of the independent inquiry, led by senior civil servant Sue Gray, which he said will report as soon as possible. There were calls across the House for Johnson to resign. On January 19, Bury South MP Christian Wakeford defected from the Conservative Party to the Labour Party. Conservative former Minister David Davis called for Johnson to resign, quoting Leo Amery calling on Neville Chamberlain to resign during the Norway debate in 1940, and saying, "You have sat there too long for all the good you have done. In the name of God, go." On January 25, the Metropolitan Police's chief commander, Cressida Dick, announced that they were commencing investigations into the Downing Street parties. An abbreviated version of the Sue Gray report into the controversy was released on January 31, where Gray concluded there was a failure of leadership over the events that she had examined. The release of the full report was delayed pending the Metropolitan Police's investigation. In April 2022, Johnson was issued a fixed penalty notice as police determined that he committed a criminal offence by breaching the COVID-19 lockdown regulations. Johnson therefore became the first Prime Minister in British history to have been sanctioned for breaking the law while in office. According to Downing Street insiders, Johnson was involved in instigating a party on the occasion of Lee Cain leaving Number 10. What had begun as press office drinks became a party after Johnson arrived, gave a speech and poured drinks for staff. Labour's deputy leader, Angela Rayner said, "If the latest reports are true, it would mean that not only did the Prime Minister attend parties, but he had a hand in instigating at least one of them. He has deliberately misled the British people at every turn. The Prime Minister has demeaned his office." On April 21, MPs voted to refer Johnson to the Parliamentary Privileges Committee to investigate whether he knowingly misled Parliament. Steve Baker said Johnson's marvellous contrition only lasted as long as it took to get out of the headmaster's study. Following the May 2022 local elections, many leading Conservatives in areas where the Conservatives had done badly blamed Johnson and calling on Johnson to resign. On June 6, Graham Brady announced that the threshold for a vote on Johnson's leadership had been passed. The vote was scheduled for later that same day. On March 3, 2023, an interim report from the Commons Select Committee of Privileges said there was evidence that strongly suggests breaches of coronavirus regulations would have been obvious to Johnson. The report also said there is evidence that those who were advising Mr. Johnson about what to say to the press and in the House were themselves struggling to contend that some gatherings were within the rules. Johnson said none of the evidence showed he knowingly misled Parliament. The report stated that the Commons may have been misled on multiple occasions and Johnson did not correct the statements at the earliest opportunity. The committee also stated that Johnson had personal knowledge over lockdown gatherings in Number 10, which he could have disclosed. While speaking in the House of Commons in January 2022, Johnson falsely blamed Starmer for the non-prosecution of the serial sex offender Jimmy Savile when Starmer was Director of Public Prosecutions in the Crown Prosecution Service. Starmer was DPP in the years immediately prior to Savile's death, but there is no evidence he was involved in the decision to not have him prosecuted. A few days later, Johnson defended his comments but conceded that Starmer had nothing to do personally with those decisions by the CPS not to investigate Savile. In the week prior to and throughout the Platinum Jubilee of Elizabeth II in June 2022, it had been speculated that a vote of confidence in Johnson's leadership of the Conservative Party might soon occur. On June 6, 2022, the Conservative Party announced that Johnson would face a vote of confidence in his leadership of the party, after at least 54 Conservative MPs wrote no confidence letters to Sir Graham Brady, the chairman of the 1922 committee. Johnson won the vote, with 211 in favour and 148 against. The number of rebel MPs was larger than had been expected. The result was described by Keir Starmer as the beginning of the end for Johnson's premiership. Following heavy Conservative defeats in the June 23, 2022 by-elections in Wakefield and Tiverton and Honiton, former party leader Michael Howard called for Johnson to resign, saying, "Mr. Johnson's biggest asset has always been his ability to win votes, but I'm afraid yesterday's results make it clear that he no longer has that ability." Oliver Dowden, the co-chairman of the Conservative Party, resigned saying, "Somebody must take responsibility." Johnson announced that he had no intention of changing or resigning. Senior Conservatives accused him of increasingly delusional behavior. On June 26, 2022, Johnson said, "At the moment I'm thinking actively about the third term and what could happen then, but I will review that when I get to it." He also claimed that he intended to stay as Prime Minister until the mid-2030s, although Number 10 later said that he had been joking. Government Deputy Chief Whip Chris Pincher resigned on June 30, 2022, saying he had drunk far too much the night before at the Carlton Club in St James's, London, and having embarrassed myself and other people. It was later alleged that he sexually assaulted two men, and he was suspended as an MP. On July 3, 2022, 6 new allegations against Pincher emerged, involving behavior over a decade. Johnson allegedly referred to Pincher as Handsy, and Cummings said Johnson joked about him being Pincher by name, Pincher by nature in 2020, leading to calls for Johnson to explain how much he knew about Pincher's behavior. Ministers initially said that Johnson was unaware of any specific complaints against Pincher when he was appointed as Deputy Chief Whip. The BBC then reported, however, that an official complaint and subsequent investigation into Pincher, while he was at the Foreign Office, July 2019 to February 2020, had confirmed his misconduct, and that Johnson had been made aware at that time. Sir Simon MacDonald, former Permanent Under-Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, later said that the Prime Minister had been briefed in person about Pincher. On July 5, 2022, Sunak and Javid resigned within minutes of each other. 549 followed over the next 24 hours by 11 other ministers, as well as Conservative MPs from parliamentary private secretary and other government positions. Other backbenchers also withdrew their support for Johnson. Many of the MPs stated that the Pincher affair had led them to change their minds on the suitability of Johnson to be Prime Minister. It was reported on July 6 that Johnson could face another confidence vote, with members of the 1922 committee considering changing the rules as soon as that evening to allow this to happen. By July 6, there had been a total of 31 resignations. As of May 2022, the government comprised 122 ministers. By the morning of July 7, the newly installed Chancellor of the Exchequer, Nadhim Zahawi, publicly stated his belief that Johnson should resign. Within hours, the BBC and other media reported Johnson's intention to resign. Johnson announced his resignation at 12:30 p.m. "I know that there will be many who are relieved, but perhaps quite a few who will be disappointed. And I want you to know how sad I am to give up the best job in the world, but them's the breaks." Upon reports of his resignation, the pound sterling temporarily strengthened in value, and UK stocks rose. He remained as Prime Minister until September, while the Conservative Party chose a new leader. On September 5, 2022, it was announced that Liz Truss had won the Conservative leadership election. She became Prime Minister the next day. During his farewell speech outside 10 Downing Street on September 6, 2022, Johnson referred to the Roman statesman Cincinnatus. Some commentators noted that, while, as Johnson said, Cincinnatus returned to his plough, he was also later recalled to power. In November 2020, Johnson announced a 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution, to include ending the sale of petrol and diesel cars and vans by 2030, quadrupling the amount of offshore wind power capacity within a decade, funding emissions-cutting proposals, and spurning a proposed green post-COVID-19 recovery. In 2021, the Johnson government announced plans to cut carbon emissions by 78% by 2035. Johnson announced that the UK would join the global methane pledge to cut methane emissions by 30% by 2030 at the 26th Colombian Pesos Summit, which the UK hosted. Before the summit, representatives of Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth criticized Johnson's comments on plans to introduce enforceable limits on carbon emissions for other countries, which they accused of being unsubstantive, and his government faced criticism from environmental groups for cutting taxes on domestic air travel, given the environmental impact of aviation. In April 2022, Johnson announced that 8 more nuclear reactors would be built on existing nuclear power plant sites and called for an expansion in wind energy. Under these plans, up to 95% of the UK's electricity could come from low-carbon power sources by 2030. Johnson supported the European Union, Mercosur Free Trade Agreement, which would form one of the world's largest free trade areas. Johnson's government placed importance on the special relationship with the United States. In 2022, his government introduced an asylum deal whereby people entering the UK illegally would be sent to Rwanda. Johnson said in July 2019 that his government would be very pro-China in an interview with the Hong Kong broadcaster Phoenix TV. He voiced support for Chinese President Xi Jinping's infrastructure investment effort, the Belt and Road Initiative, and promised to keep the United Kingdom the most open economy in Europe for Chinese investment. In June 2020, Johnson announced that if China were to continue pursuing the Hong Kong national security law, the UK would offer 350,000 Hong Kong residents who are British national, overseas, passport holders, and 2.6 million other eligible individuals, the chance to move to the UK. China accused the UK of interfering in its internal affairs. Johnson declined to describe the Chinese government's treatment of the Uyghur people as genocide, despite use of the term by the United States. Johnson's government argued that genocide should be decided by the International Criminal Court. Nevertheless, he called what is happening to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang as utterly abhorrent. The UK joined the AUKUS Defence Pact with the United States and Australia in September 2021. The pact was denounced by China and caused a French backlash, as it usurped existing plans for Australia to procure French submarines. On July 8, 2021, the day after saying he was apprehensive about the future of Afghanistan following what was then the impending withdrawal of US troops, while announcing the near completion of British troop withdrawal from Afghanistan, Johnson expressed the view that there was no military path to victory for the Taliban. Following the fall of Kabul to the Taliban, he blamed the United States for the crisis, saying that NATO alliance members could not continue this US-led mission, a mission conceived and executed in support of America, without American logistics, without US air power and without American might. Following the formal withdrawal from the European Union in January 2020, Johnson's government entered trade negotiations with the EU. Fisheries was a major topic of the negotiations. On October 16, 2020, Johnson said that the UK must get ready for no trade deal with the EU. It was announced on December 24, 2020 that the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement had been reached. It came into force formally on May 1. A fisheries dispute between the UK and France occurred shortly afterwards. Introduction of new UK border checks were delayed until 2022 to minimize the disruption caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. In May 2022, Johnson readied a draft that would unilaterally change parts of the Northern Ireland Protocol, citing issues with medical supplies and cuts in VAT. One of the thornier points of contention involves safety regulations for food and plants, where the British government is opposed to a closer alignment with existing EU regulations. The EU rebuffed the idea of changing the text of the treaty to accommodate the British. A unilateral override by the UK would be tantamount to a breach of the agreement. As Johnson sought a more conciliatory tone, sources within the government began to stress that the draft is designed to be an insurance policy and would take years to become law. In November 2021, Johnson warned that the European Union faces a choice between sticking up for Ukraine and approving the Nord Stream 2 natural gas pipeline from Russia to Europe. During the prelude to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Johnson's government warned the Russian government not to invade Donbas. Johnson and Vladimir Putin agreed in a phone call to work towards a peaceful resolution. On February 1, 2022, Johnson arrived in Kiev on a diplomatic visit. He called the presence of the Russian armed forces near the Russia-Ukraine border the biggest security crisis that Europe has faced for decades. The Kremlin denied that it wanted to attack Ukraine. On February 20, 2022, Johnson warned that Russia is planning the biggest war in Europe since 1945 as Putin intends to invade and encircle Kiev. On February 21, 2022, Johnson condemned Russia's diplomatic recognition of two self-proclaimed republics in Donbas. On February 24, 2022, Johnson condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and ensured the UK joined in international sanctions on Russian banks and oligarchs. He later announced the UK would phase out Russian oil by the end of 2022. On April 9, 2022, Johnson traveled to Kiev and met the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. On April 16, 2022, Russia's Ministry for Foreign Affairs banned Johnson and a number of senior British politicians from visiting Russia, saying that Britain aimed to isolate Russia politically and supply the Kiev regime with lethal weapons and coordinating similar efforts on the part of NATO. Within Ukraine, Johnson is praised by many as a supporter of anti-Russian sanctions and military aid for Ukraine. On May 3, Johnson virtually addressed the Ukrainian parliament, becoming the first world leader to speak in Ukraine since the invasion. He pledged an extra £300 million in military aid to Ukraine, praised Ukraine's resistance to Russia as its finest hour and said that the West had been too slow to grasp what was actually happening prior to Russia's invasion. In July 2022, Johnson warned that it would be a mistake to cease fire and freeze the conflict. In August 2022, Johnson blamed Vladimir Putin for the emerging global energy crisis. Thank you for watching this part of the video.